Imagine driving your favorite vintage cruiser only to have your weekend warrior taken away from you to comply with tightening emission standards that were not even considered when your classic car was made. This may seem fairly niche to you, but in some areas of the world it hits closer to home. People just trying to make ends meet, having their only transportation taken away from them just because they drive an old vehicle and cannot afford the shiny new showroom piece that's considered green and eco-friendly. While it is true that older vehicles do emit higher tailpipe emissions, this opens another series of questions. What classifies as an older vehicle? Are the so-called older vehicles still on the road in enough quantity to be statistically significant? How would a removal of older vehicles affect the general public? And is automotive even the highest polluting industry? All these questions do not have such a straightforward answer. First, I'll discuss what classifies an older vehicle. Second, I'll explain how the removal of non-compliant vehicles would affect the general public. Finally, I'll explore the automotive industry and if it even is the most polluting industry. So to start off, what classifies an old car? So there are certain ways to classify an old car, and a lot of it is just determined by the public eye of what is new, what is old. But there are a few rules and regulations that do apply some guidelines to what is considered new and old. So starting off with the Department of Transportation and registration. So a few states have what are called vintage or classic plates, sometimes called historic vehicle plates. And these are issued on vehicles that are 25 to 30 years old. And they are meant for specific older vehicles that are not daily driven, mostly with historical significance. But that is kind of one guideline for what is considered an old vehicle, is the 25 to 30-year mark of a historical or vintage license plate. Now the next guideline is actually a system on the car, and it's called OBD, Onboard Diagnostics. Now what this is in 1996, all the auto manufacturers got together and decided to come up with a universal standard for automotive diagnostics. And they called it OBD2 to replace what was, retroactively called OBD1, which was everyone's unique diagnostic systems to each domestic, import, whatever. So they came up with OBD2, and it was a standardized diagnostic system across the industry. And what it came with was called a downstream oxygen sensor, downstream O2 sensor. And what this can do is actually monitor the car's emission systems, and it can self-check to make sure that they are functioning correctly. So unlike an older vehicle where you'd have to take it to a smog station and have them put a gas analyzer in the tailpipe, the new cars can check themselves. And if they're out of spec, they will throw a check engine light. And that's how newer cars, 1996 and newer, do their emissions. They check themselves, and if they have an issue, they will tell you. Now, with the 1996 and newer and the DOT plates, 25 to 30 years old, the average age of that car is 27, 28 years old in that ballpark. So the majority of light duty on-road vehicles were established 25 to 30 years ago. The standards were. So those standards were set in place before those cars, what is considered an old vehicle. So there are certain older vehicles that are still compliant with these emissions laws. But if you actually look at the statistics, according to IHS Markit, the average age of an on-road vehicle today is 12 years old, not 25, 30 years old. It's only 12. So the vast majority of vehicles now are not approaching 30 years old. They're, fairly recent, depending on, how you justify an old car. But according to Department of Transportation and the OBD system, 25 to 30 years old is generally considered an old vehicle. So now that we've gone through kind of the average vehicle age and, it's the average vehicle age is lower than the emission standards were when they were developed 30 years ago, and the number of vehicles of older cars is lower than modern cars. So there are going to be more newer cars than there are going to be older cars. And then we'll kind of get into here in the next time how this affects the general public. So, according to Statista, in 1995 alone, 1995 model year, there were 205,000 cars registered of 1995 in the United States. Now, 1990 to 1995, so 5-year gap, there's 1.18 million cars registered. Now, if you shift that to 2010 to 2015, that is 1.55 million. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, and it really isn't, but you have to think of it in a different light. So, think about the 96 split again. So, 96 and older, all the way back as far as you can go, and then go 96 and newer. So when I mean 96 and newer, I mean 96 to present day. So if you go 96 to present day and look at the total number of vehicles and look at 1995 and back, the amount of vehicles that are on the road registered, the vast majority of them are 1996 and newer, which means they're emissions compliant. But what this means is that everything that is justified as a new car is emissions compliant, and everything that is justified as an old car is non-emissions compliant, with some variation here and there. But also, a registered vehicle does not mean it's a daily driven vehicle. Now, what does that mean? So you can register a car for a number of reasons. It could be a sentimental vehicle that you don't drive, or whatnot if it's just insured, but it may not be a daily driven vehicle. So, and according to IMR, the newer a vehicle, the newer the vehicle, the higher the mileage, the year annual mileage. So it starts, say, 2020, 2021, and then it continues to go down from there. As you go older, the miles per year goes down. So older cars, yes, they pollute more, but their annual mileage is lower, and there's less of them. So it kind of offsets itself in a kind of backwards way, but it does. And then another thing you need to look in is that most of the public does not use public transportation. They use their own vehicles. So 86% of commuters drive their own personal vehicle. So that's the majority of transit is personal vehicles, which includes these 1995 and older vehicles. So, now that we've kind of gone through the amount of registered vehicles and their miles per year and how it kind of connects to, 86% of the public, let's look at some alternative pollution sources that maybe more effectively put the legal power towards instead of the automotive industry. So some alternative industries are the fuel industry. Now this sounds kind of counterintuitive, but the fuel industry differs from the automotive industry that this is the production and consumption of all fossil fuels. And the consumption in all industries, not just automotive. So the biggest polluter in that is coal. Burning coal is 14 billion tons annually is burned. Oil's close at 12 billion, and gasoline is half of coal at 7 billion. So yes, gasoline is up there, but it's not the key factors such as coal and oil are. And then you get into agriculture. So agriculture is second place, and it's 13 to 18% of the total yearly pollution figure. And the thing is with agriculture is the largest CO2 and methane producer in agriculture is actually livestock, cows. And the reason agriculture is second place is because methane is much more potent than CO2. Now, if you go down that list, transportation is actually number 5. It's in 5th place. Now, it's 24% of CO2, but the reason it's in 5th place is because methane is so much more potent. So, light-duty trucks and cars, basically your daily commuters are 60% of that transportation amount. And then the other 40% is planes and freight. So that's, trains and your heavy duty, your semis, tractor trailers. That's the rest of that. So, I've kind of gone over how the removal of older vehicles would, you know, if you could remove them to reduce emissions, it's not really worth it because, it would cause these people trouble who rely on these vehicles, to go about their lives. And the carbon footprint of these old vehicles is fairly small compared to everything else because, less miles per year, there aren't that many of them. And yes, they pollute a bit more, but they're offset by other industries. So there's really no reason to get rid of them to, disrupt people's lives. And, if they can't afford a new car, it's just not worth it. So all I want to say is, if there's any talk of this in your local jurisdictions, put your voice in there and tell them, no, you're disrupting people's livelihoods and there's other things you could do that are more significant than this. So, but that's kind of all I have to say for that. So, yeah, thank you for listening and thank you.